Asset impairment is such a significant issue, I thought I'd give you just a very quick, simple but very practical example of what it means in a very real context. The example I'm going to pick on is the Cross-City Tunnel, which goes underneath Sydney, and whilst it is actually a group of assets, could I please ask you to assume that for the purpose of this exercise it is a single asset. Now, the process of recognizing an asset impairment begins by working out that maybe an asset impairment is necessary, and that involves looking for indicators of impairment. Now, if you look at this picture here, you would probably see the most obvious indicator of impairment. When you look at the tunnel there, you can see there's no cars in the picture. That tells you that there's a problem there with the number of cars that are using the tunnel, and this would have been just one of many operational observations which would have dictated that there were indicators of impairment. There would also have been some financial indicators. They would have missed their cash flow forecasts, they would have missed their earnings forecasts, and it's probably fair to say that on every metric the Cross-City Tunnel was indicating that it was performing very poorly. Once you determine that and there are indicators of impairment, you need to determine the recoverable amount. For something like the Cross-City Tunnel, you can't exactly work out a fair value because there's no market in second-hand tunnels, but recoverable amount would most likely be determined having regard to the value in use, and the value in use would be determined on the basis of discounted cash flows. Now, it's relatively straightforward here because the Cross-City Tunnel is quite a simple project really, or operation. Now, the Cross-City Tunnel was actually done as a lease, initially for 25 years, so after 1 year there were 24 years remaining. Initially, there were 30,000 cars a day using it, and unless that was going to increase significantly, that would be the ongoing utilisation of the tunnel. That suggests in the first year, almost 11 million cars a year, and if there was an average toll of $3, that would have meant annual cash inflows of $32,850,000. Cash outflows of $6 million, which would have resulted in net cash flows of 26.85 million in the first year. Please note there was a mechanism for adjusting the tolls, and it must be assumed that the cash outflows were going to increase as well by an inflation factor. So what we did with this was we then just estimated what the cash flows would likely be for the next 24 years, and we discounted it to determine a value in use of $402 million. Now, this is actually quite reasonable in the current context because the determinants of the cash flows is actually pretty obvious. So what we have to do now is we have to compare the recoverable amount to the book value. The Cross-City Tunnel was built at a cost of about $765 million. We've got a recoverable amount of $402 million, and that would suggest that we need to recognise an asset impairment of about $363 million. Ouch. So what we'd have to recognise is an impairment expense of $363 million, and we'd recognise accumulated impairment of $363 million. In case you're wondering, the $363 million impairment is perhaps not unreasonable, because when you looked at the financial statements for a half owner of the tunnel, they were recognising an asset impairment of just over $180 million. So the numbers here are fairly reasonable, but importantly what it does show you is the sort of process that you'd have to go through to determine the value in use by looking at the cash flows and then discounting them. Thank you.